"You can't put a fence through my kitchen," I shouted as I kicked open the back door, only to be met with the unbelievable sight of a chain-link barrier cutting clean across my ranch property, wedged halfway through the chicken coop and slicing just feet from my back porch. I blinked twice, thinking maybe I was seeing things after the red-eye flight home. But no, there it was, real and rusted, complete with freshly posted HOA property, no trespassing signs zip-tied every 5 feet. My chickens were clucking in panic on one side, a confused goat bleated from the other, and standing proudly in front of the monstrosity was a woman in a pressed navy blue blazer, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, and an expression that practically screamed, "Try me." That was my introduction to Judith, the HOA president who decided that while I was out of town, she would seize part of my ranch for community green space. She had no idea she'd just started a war with the actual landowner. Judith didn't flinch as I stormed over. She turned slightly, her heels clicking like a gavel striking a courtroom desk. "Good afternoon," she said with a tone soaked in condescension. "You must be Mr. Dalton. We sent notices to the temporary mailbox we set up near Lot 76. I felt my jaw lock. Lot 76? That was 2 acres deep into what used to be an open hayfield, now covered in rows of cookie-cutter homes, all suspiciously identical with beige siding and plastic flamingos. I glanced behind her and realized something that made my stomach twist. They had built into my land. Not just nudged into it. No, this was a full invasion. Gazebos, dog parks, swing sets, all sprawled across what had once been cattle pasture. My cattle pasture? What notice? You didn't send anything to my legal address. I barely recognized my voice, low and simmering. You don't own this land. I do. Oh well, Judith sniffed, flipping through her clipboard like it was a sacred text. According to the new subdivision zoning overlay, this parcel was left unregistered, and the HOA board motioned for reclamation under community integration. Section 8C of the Charter. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. She was quoting HOA bylaws at me about my own land, as if her authority came from a badge and not a flyer someone printed in a minivan. My boots crunched the gravel as I stepped closer, looking her dead in the eyes. "Lady, I don't care what Section 8C says. This ranch has been in my family since before your HOA ever existed. Since before most of these houses existed." A slight crowd had begun to gather. A few homeowners peeked out from their manicured lawns, murmuring to each other. A kid on a scooter stopped to gawk. Judith, sensing the audience, turned on her heel and addressed them. "We tried to be generous," she announced loudly. "We even offered Mr. Dalton an adjacent parcel near the waste management lot to rebuild his livestock pen. But he's chosen confrontation over cooperation." I was stunned. Not just at the gall but at the manipulation. She'd painted herself as some magnanimous community leader and me as a stubborn relic clinging to dirt. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. If anyone could shut this down fast, it'd be them. After all, I had property records, tax filings, aerial photos. But when Deputy Harris arrived 20 minutes later, his answer chilled me to the core. "It's complicated," he said, scratching his head beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "There's a zoning conflict filed with the county last year. Some paperwork glitch during the land registration caused overlapping claims. Until it's sorted, we can't enforce either side's complaint. My ranch, my grandfather's land, rendered a glitch because someone at the courthouse filed 2 maps instead of 1. I looked around and saw the glee bubbling in Judith's eyes. She had won, at least for now. She smiled sweetly and said, "You might want to call a lawyer. These things can get messy." I didn't respond. I just turned back to the house, stomped inside, and locked the door behind me. But I wasn't done. That night, I opened the old wooden chest that sat under the window, my grandfather's papers, sealed tight for decades. Inside were yellowed maps, land grant documents, and a thick envelope marked Property Protections, Dalton Family Holdings. And in that envelope, Nestled between notarized pages and embossed county seals, was a single clause in bold. In the event of charter expiration, default, or illegal encroachment, the property shall revert to the grantor or their heirs. I stared at it for a long minute. Revert. As in return. The charter, was it still active? Did the HOA even have legal ground to operate here if their founding documents expired or if they overstepped boundaries? The next morning, I was at the county recorder's office by 8:01 a.m. It took an hour of sweet-talking, paperwork digging, and a $45 expedited lookup, but there it was, hidden in plain sight. The HOA charter had technically expired 9 months ago. No renewal had been filed. No vote had been recorded. According to legal status, their authority was null. And yet they'd built fences, taken over land, and redirected utilities into homes that were now legally squatting on my family's ranch. When I called Judith with this information, her response was exactly what I expected. Laughter. Sharp, cutting laughter that echoed over the phone like she was daring me to try. "Nice fantasy," she said. "But we're already here. You think you can fight 120 homeowners?" I didn't answer. Not then. But I didn't have to. Because the next time we spoke, it wouldn't be on the phone. It would be on my land, in front of a sheriff, a stack of eviction letters, and the most legally satisfying reversal of power she never saw coming. And the moment that fence came down would be the moment the entire neighborhood learned who really owned every inch they stood on. The following morning carried a chill that didn't come from the wind. I stood in front of the county clerk's building, watching pedestrians hustle through the cold, not knowing that inside my jacket pocket was a document capable of flipping a whole suburban empire on its head. The envelope containing the original land clause felt heavier than its weight, like it was pulsing with generations of pride. I'd spent half the night going over it, every line, every legal term, and every inch of the surveyor's seal. But I wasn't a lawyer, and I knew if I wanted to take on a full-blown HOA with a history of burying residents in paperwork, I needed someone who not only knew the law, but could wield it like a sword. So I called Vanessa. Cousin Vanessa wasn't your typical family lawyer. She was sharp, loud, and proudly allergic to nonsense. She once shredded a corporate attorney in court so badly, he took an early retirement. More importantly, she owed me. Years ago, I covered her rent for 6 months when she was fresh out of law school and waiting for her first paycheck. When I called and explained what had happened, she was already packing her laptop bag before I finished the sentence. By noon, she was sitting across from me in the diner near the courthouse, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other, scribbling faster than a court stenographer. "You're telling me the HOA never filed a charter renewal?" she asked, flipping through her tablet, scanning public records in real time. "And they built on your land after their charter lapsed?" I nodded, sipping coffee that tasted like burnt motor oil. "They fenced off part of the ranch, threw a party in the middle of the old cow pasture, and told me to take a smaller lot next to the dumpsters as compensation." Vanessa blinked, then broke into a wide, evil grin. "Oh, they're done. They're absolutely cooked. This clause, this reversion of rights, it's not just enforceable. It's nuclear. If the HOA doesn't legally exist anymore, then their entire authority is void. That means everything built, every enforcement notice, every fine, all of it was done under a false charter." I raised an eyebrow. "Even the land they sold?" She leaned in. "Especially the land they sold. If the subdivision was developed while the legal rights hadn't been formally transferred and the charter wasn't renewed, then technically, those homes were built on land you still owned. The HOA doesn't have the power to grant what they never had." The air shifted. For the first time since this mess started, I didn't feel like I was on the back foot. I was no longer reacting. I was planning. Vanessa spent the next hour drafting the framework for what she called a reinstatement action, a legal maneuver to reassert rightful land control. It wasn't quite an eviction notice, but it was the first shot across the bow. With it, we'd notify all residents that their homes, while legally purchased, were sitting on land that now required a valid lease agreement or formal purchase under new authority. My authority. By the time we left the diner, Vanessa had already called in a favor with a title examiner, a zoning consultant, and a paralegal team she affectionately referred to as her paperwork assassins. Meanwhile, I made a quiet trip back to the ranch and stood at the property line, staring at the mockery that had once been open field. Rows of homes, driveways, fake grass, garden gnomes, and SUV-packed garages lined what used to be open prairie. I walked the perimeter slowly, taking photos, noting boundaries. It all looked so artificial now. Neatly packaged families on land they thought belonged to a smiling HOA, but soon they'd learn the foundation of their subdivision sat on a lie. The next step was personal delivery. Vanessa insisted on serving the HOA board face-to-face, and I didn't argue. We waited until the next scheduled board meeting, which was conveniently posted online with time and location, a rented community hall near the clubhouse that still smelled like vinyl chairs and lemon-scented cleaner. Judith was already inside, surrounded by clipboard warriors and a few smug-faced board members. She didn't notice us at first. Not until Vanessa marched straight to the front and laid down a manila folder with the precision of a grenade. "I'm Vanessa Dalton, legal representative of Mr. Dalton, the lawful owner of this land. Your charter expired. You built illegally. Your HOA no longer has jurisdiction. And you are now trespassing on private property." The room fell silent. Judith stared like someone had poured cold soup in her shoes. She slowly reached for the folder, flipping through the documents as the rest of the board leaned in. One man paled. Another woman dropped her pen. I stood beside Vanessa, arms crossed, watching the storm build. "This is absurd," Judith said finally, but her voice cracked. "You can't just declare yourselves landlords." Vanessa didn't blink. "We're not declaring. We're enforcing. Your own foundational documents contain a clause, Clause 12 to be exact, that reverts land rights in the event of charter expiration or misuse. Your expiration date passed 9 months ago. The county confirmed. You've been operating without authority and expanding without legal entitlement. The law doesn't protect mistakes made under false authority. It corrects them. You think you can scare us?" Another board member barked. "You can't just walk in here and take over a neighborhood." "We're not taking over," I said finally, stepping forward. "We're reclaiming what never legally left." That line hit them like a freight train. One woman from the board gathered her things and left. 2 others whispered and flipped through their binders in panic. Judith, to her credit, kept her poker face longer than most, but even she knew this was spiraling fast. She slammed the folder shut and hissed, "Then we'll see you in court." Vanessa shrugged. "We'll be there. With deeds, surveys, witnesses, and the sheriff." By the time we walked out of the community hall, Vanessa had already scheduled meetings with the sheriff's department and filed intent to reclaim land use with the county's civil enforcement division. We weren't just poking the bear, we were building a cage around it. The legal wheels had begun turning, and no matter how much Judith screamed or threatened, there was no unspinning the truth. That night, I stood on the porch of my ranch house, the stars gleaming above like silent witnesses. The fence still stood, but now it looked weaker, like it knew its time was up. I sipped a glass of bourbon and looked out across the land that should never have been stolen. It wouldn't be long now. Soon, the fence would fall, the homes would tremble, and the people who thought I was some crazy rancher clinging to dirt would come to realize something far more unsettling. They weren't homeowners. They were tenants, and their new landlord had just sharpened his pen. The town hall parking lot was packed tighter than a rodeo on Saturday night. SUVs and minivans overflowed into the nearby church lot as anxious residents shuffled into the building. Word had spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. Apparently someone was claiming to own the land their homes were built on. Some thought it was a hoax, others believed it was a stunt to get attention, but all of them were showing up to see if their lives were really about to change. I pulled up in my old pickup and parked just far enough back to get a good view of the growing crowd. Vanessa was already inside, setting up documents and handing out copies of the original leasehold agreement to any resident who wanted proof. The tension inside the hall was electric. People murmured in every corner, many holding HOA newsletters, zoning maps, or printouts from social media threads. Judith was up front near the podium, arms crossed like a queen trying to hold her crumbling castle together. The moment I walked in, heads turned. Some faces were confused, others angry. A few nodded silently like they already knew I wasn't just some disgruntled old rancher. I took my seat in the second row, not in the shadows this time, but front and center. I wanted them all to hear me clearly when the moment came. Judith tapped the microphone. Her smile was stretched thin as she welcomed everyone and began the meeting with her usual tone of overly rehearsed authority. She talked about potholes, a new neighborhood watch initiative, even an upcoming bake sale. It was almost comical how long she dragged it out before finally addressing the elephant in the room. "We've recently received a challenge to our land charter," she began, scanning the room with that same smug confidence. "A claim from Mr. Dalton, suggesting that the HOA is no longer in legal operation and that this land somehow belongs to him. I want to reassure you all that we are taking every step to contest this ridiculous assertion." That's when Vanessa stood up. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried across the room with the kind of confidence that only came from someone who knew she had the truth on her side. "It's not a suggestion, Judith. It's a legal fact," she said, lifting the thick folder in her hands. "Your HOA charter expired last year. No vote was held. No paperwork was filed. Which means every decision, every construction project, every inch of land used since then, was done outside the bounds of your authority." Judith tried to cut her off, but Vanessa wasn't interested in playing games. She turned to the crowd. "Let me be clear. Mr. Dalton's family never sold the land outright. What the developers had was a conditional use lease that was contingent on the HOA's continued legal existence. When that charter expired, the lease lapsed. Meaning, by law, this property reverted back to the original owners. Mr. Dalton is now your landlord." A few gasps escaped from the back. One man stood up and shouted, "Are you saying we don't own our homes?" Vanessa nodded calmly. "You own the structures. But the land underneath them? That's a different story. Think of it like a mobile home park. You own the house, but you pay rent for the land it sits on. In this case, the HOA was supposed to maintain that lease. They didn't. Which means your homes are sitting on private property, without a valid contract." The hall exploded into chaos. People shouted over one another. Some demanded answers from Judith. Others questioned the board. A few began looking around nervously, realizing they may have just become squatters overnight. Judith banged her fist on the podium, yelling that this was all a lie, that Vanessa was twisting words. But she didn't have the documents. Vanessa did. And she handed them out freely. A tall man in a flannel shirt stood and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "So what now? Do we all get evicted?" I stood then. The room quieted again. "No," I said plainly. "Not unless you give me a reason to. I'm not here to throw anyone out. I'm here because my land was stolen, piece by piece, while I was away. And instead of working with me, your board decided to fence me out and pretend I didn't exist." A woman from the front row called out, "But we didn't know. We just bought these homes. We trusted the HOA." I nodded. "And that's why I'm not blaming all of you. This isn't about revenge. It's about making it right. But the board knew. Or they should have. And now, every one of you deserves to know the truth." Another resident asked what the terms would be moving forward. Vanessa stepped in to explain the offer we were preparing. A new land use agreement that would honor current homeownership but place the land under a simple, fair lease system, low cost, legally sound, and fully recorded. In other words, we weren't asking people to leave. We were asking them to finally make it official. That didn't stop the board from panicking. Judith called an emergency vote of no confidence, but it was too late. Half the crowd had already started walking out. Some muttered angrily about fraud. Others promised lawsuits. But most just looked stunned. The illusion had shattered. Their tidy little neighborhood, with its neatly painted fences and quarterly potlucks, had been built on an administrative mirage. As we left the town hall, I saw something I hadn't expected. A man stood quietly at the edge of the parking lot, holding one of the documents Vanessa had passed out. He looked like a retired vet, sharp eyes, calm stance. As I passed him, he offered a firm handshake. "Thanks for handling it the right way," he said. "Too many folks would have gone straight to the bulldozers." I gave a small nod. Not looking to make enemies. Just reclaim what's mine. That night, Judith held a private emergency meeting with the remaining board members, but the damage was already done. The next morning, 5 homeowners contacted us to voluntarily sign new agreements. 2 more sent apology emails, and 1 anonymous envelope showed up at the ranch gate with a copy of the HOA charter and a note scribbled across it. She knew. We all did. The power was shifting. Not through shouting, not through threats, but through something more dangerous, proof. And now that the truth was out, there was no putting it back in the box. The residents had seen the documents, the expiration dates, the signatures. They knew the land didn't belong to the HOA anymore. It belonged to me. And they weren't just neighbors now. They were tenants. And whether they liked it or not, their lease was about to get real. The days that followed were filled with paperwork, late-night calls, and the slow unraveling of everything the HOA once held together with bubblegum policies and empty threats. Vanessa set up a temporary legal station inside my barn, of all places. It was the only space large enough to organize the growing mountain of documents, lease agreements, zoning certificates, and incoming tenant applications. We didn't announce anything formally yet, but the news spread faster than wildfire. Residents began trickling in, some cautious, others just exhausted by the entire ordeal, asking the same question in different ways. How do we stay? I'd expected resistance, maybe even protests or picket signs planted in the lawn. But what came instead was a quiet, sobering shift. People were tired of the HOA's nonsense. Once the curtain was pulled back, and they saw the hollow shell of the organization that had fined them for mailbox colors and patio furniture, they weren't eager to defend it. They wanted normalcy, stability, and surprisingly, many saw me, a land boots, calloused hands and all, as the safer bet. We structured the lease terms with care. Vanessa insisted every clause be simple, clear, and human. There were no surprise fees, no absurd penalties for growing the wrong flower or parking the wrong way. Instead, we focused on fair use and mutual respect. Residents would pay a small monthly land fee, much lower than their old HOA dues, and in return, they'd get legally binding land rights, improved shared spaces, and freedom from micromanagement. For those who refused? Well, Vanessa had a legal term for it: non-compliant occupancy. I had a simpler term: trespassing. The first group to push back was, predictably, the former board members. Judith wasn't just angry, she was unhinged. She barged onto my property 2 days after the town hall meeting, stomping through the gravel like she still had a badge. She waved a stack of papers in my face, shouting about cease and desist orders and emergency injunctions. Vanessa stepped out of the barn, calm as ever, and handed her a sealed envelope in return. "This is your official land use termination notice," she said. "Your property is one of the lots that overlaps directly with the original Dalton land grant. Unless you sign the new lease, you have 30 days to vacate." Judith's face went pale, then red, then a strange twitchy purple. She opened the envelope, scanned the document, and then looked up with a smile that barely hid the panic. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You've made a powerful enemy." Vanessa didn't blink. "You already tried to steal land from a man who owns more than you realized. I'd say you're the one who should be nervous." Judith stormed off, but the damage was done. Within 24 hours, 3 of her former board members broke ranks and signed new leases. One of them even offered to volunteer for the new community garden project I'd quietly proposed. I didn't care for politics, but I knew that if I wanted this new arrangement to work, I needed buy-in, not just from a few sympathetic neighbors, but from the entire block. So I did something Judith never would have. I invited everyone over. We hosted a weekend open house on the ranch. Not just for the residents but for their kids, pets, and even skeptical relatives. I rolled out hay bales for seating, roasted half a dozen chickens over open flame, and let the younger kids run wild on the old field where my goats used to graze. Vanessa brought in a local band and printed out brochures that explained the lease terms in plain language, no legalese. By sundown, folks who'd once glared at me from behind HOA-mandated blinds were sitting at picnic tables beside me, laughing, drinking sweet tea, and asking about the property's history. I told them everything. About my grandfather's legacy, about the land grant, about how my family had been pushed out piece by piece under the excuse of development. And I told them why I fought to get it back. Not just to win some personal vendetta, but because what they were living under wasn't right. They'd been paying for control, not support. And it was time to flip the script. After that day, things moved faster. Within a week, more than half of the homeowners signed the new lease. Vanessa drafted a simplified community charter. Optional, voluntary, and advisory, not mandatory like the old HOA rules. People could suggest ideas, vote on shared projects, or opt out entirely. It was freedom, not enforcement, and most of them appreciated the difference. But not everyone came around. On the 10th day, we got word that Judith had filed a last-ditch lawsuit claiming unlawful seizure of property. She hired a high-powered attorney from out of town, and the court scheduled an emergency hearing. Vanessa prepped for it like a general preparing for battle, stacking her evidence with brutal precision. She had the expired charter, the unfiled extensions, the original land deed, surveyor testimony, and even drone footage that showed the construction creeping onto unpermitted sections. We were ready for war. The courtroom was packed. Judith's lawyer was smooth, polished, and arrogant. He tried to paint us as frauds, manipulators, and opportunists, but his argument fell apart the moment Vanessa presented the time-stamped county records and the signed declaration from the original land use contract. The judge, an older gentleman with a farmer's tan and a sharp mind, leaned back in his chair, scanned the documents, and then turned to Judith. "Did you or did you not know your charter expired before continuing development?" Judith hesitated, then answered, "We thought we had a grace period." The judge nodded slowly. "That's not how the law works." In under 20 minutes, he dismissed the lawsuit and upheld our land claim as valid. Vanessa didn't gloat. She just packed her files, nodded respectfully to the court, and walked out like it was another Tuesday. Outside, I felt the weight lift. We weren't just winning anymore. We'd already won. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ownership, legacy, and proving that when you steal land from someone who knows its worth, not just in dollars but in roots, you're picking a fight you can't win. By that weekend, Judith had moved out. Her house sold quietly to a couple from out of state who'd heard the neighborhood was under new, better management. Ironically, they were thrilled to avoid an HOA. I didn't tell them the full story. Not yet. But I knew they'd find out in time, hopefully over grilled chicken, with a view of the sunset over my land. Because now they weren't just neighbors. They were part of the ranch. And under my watch, this land would never be stolen again. The first real test of peace came quietly, without noise or ceremony. It was early morning, fog hanging low across the fields, when I saw a moving van roll down the hill toward the far end of the subdivision. The home it stopped in front of was the last one still owned by a former board member, Judith's closest ally, Greg Pearson. He'd been silent since the court ruling, never responded to lease notices, never returned calls. Most folks figured he was waiting to make a statement with one last dramatic stand. But there was no shouting, no last-minute resistance. Just a gray moving truck, a man with slouched shoulders, and a real estate sign with a red "Sold" sticker slapped across it by noon. Greg was gone before the day was half over, and just like that, the old regime was officially out of the picture. I'd expected a kind of satisfaction, a victorious moment where I could finally breathe deep and say it was over. But what I felt instead was something else, calm. Not empty, not boastful, just a quiet certainty that things had been set right. There were no more fences slicing through my ranch, no more emails from an HOA board threatening fines over imaginary infractions. Instead, there were kids riding bikes through the open paths, families tending to small gardens without permission slips, and the distant sound of someone installing a new mailbox without fear of color violations. Peace, it turned out, didn't make a sound. It just settled in like the sunrise, slow, steady, and warm. Vanessa stayed another week, finalizing the last round of lease signatures and wrapping up legal loose ends. She ran through everything with military precision, checking every form, confirming county approvals, and making sure no one could ever undo what we'd done. On her last night, we sat on the porch watching the stars. She handed me the final signed document, the new land charter, written in plain language, approved by both the county and the majority of residents. No hidden clauses, no buried fines, just honesty and simplicity. You could have scorched the earth, you know, she said, sipping from her mug. Judith gave you every reason to. I didn't want to burn it, I said. I just wanted it back. She nodded. Well, you've got it now. And you turned it into something better. When she left the next morning, I felt like a chapter had closed, but a better one was starting. People waved at me when I drove through the neighborhood now. Some even stopped by with homemade pies or asked questions about the land's history. I told them about my grandfather's first barn raising, about the flood of '82, about the time my uncle chased a loose cow for 6 miles. They listened like it mattered, like this place had finally become more than a cluster of houses on dirt. It had roots again. But Judith wasn't quite done. A week later, I got a letter. Not from her directly, but from a TV producer in Los Angeles. Apparently, Judith had pitched her story to a reality show looking for neighborhood drama with high-stakes legal twists. They wanted to film a segment at the ranch and get both sides of the dispute. I read the letter twice, laughed, and tossed it in the fireplace. Let the world think what it wanted. I wasn't interested in fame, cameras, or turning my land into a stage. The real story had already been written, in courtrooms, in documents, in fire pits where former strangers now roasted marshmallows together. That weekend, I stood by the old corral and watched as a group of neighbors worked together to install a community greenhouse. It had started as a casual idea at one of our post-HOA gatherings, something someone suggested while drinking beer and watching the sunset. Now they'd pooled resources, bought materials, and were building it by hand. No approval forms, no board votes, just willing hands and a shared vision. It was the kind of thing the old HOA never would have allowed, too messy, too individual. But here it made perfect sense. One of the guys, Martin, waved me over. He was a retired firefighter, burly and sun-worn, with a voice like gravel. "We saved you a spot," he said, gesturing toward the center. "You still grow tomatoes, right?" I laughed. "Used to. Might be a good time to start again." As I dug my hands into the soil, something shifted. This wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't even about winning. It was about reclaiming something that had been slowly chipped away, not just by bulldozers and signatures, but by arrogance, bureaucracy, and the belief that people had no say in where they lived. But now they did. And they'd chosen a path built on trust and shared effort, not surveillance and superiority. Later that night, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find a teenage girl and her mother standing nervously on the porch. They lived in one of the homes near the back of the neighborhood. The girl was holding a drawing, a crayon sketch of a big ranch house, a field, and a horse with the words, "Thank you for bringing the land back," written across the top. Her mom explained that she loved drawing animals and dreamed of being a vet one day, but she'd never seen a real horse until she saw mine. She asked if it was okay to take a photo sometime. I nodded and told her she could visit the stables any weekend she wanted. As they walked away, I stared at the drawing and felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't about being right anymore. It was about what came after. About what was rebuilt in place of what was lost. Weeks passed. The seasons began to shift. The land healed. The noise died down. And I kept walking the property every morning like my grandfather used to, boots pressing into familiar dirt, the horizon just as wide as ever. One afternoon, I found myself at the edge of the neighborhood, looking out at the last section that hadn't been touched by housing yet. A big open stretch of grass, wind waving through it like it still remembered the herds that once grazed there. I thought about fencing it again, not to keep people out but to create something. A riding trail, a small orchard, maybe even a proper barn again. A car pulled up behind me. It was the sheriff, same one who'd stood quietly through the earliest days of the conflict. He stepped out and walked beside me, nodding as he looked out at the same field. "You did it," he said quietly. "Still feels like it's not done," I replied. "It never is," he said. "But it's yours now. Really yours." And that was enough. Because once upon a time they tried to take my land. Now I stood on it freely, not as a victim or a tenant, but as the legal landlord of 120 families. Families who no longer feared absurd rules or crooked boards, who planted flowers without asking permission, who laughed louder, lived freer, and built something honest with their own hands. They called it a subdivision. But now it was home.